Imagine this, a peaceful retirement shattered by a tyrannical neighbor, leading to a showdown where the bully's own traps seal her fate. That's the hook that pulls you into a tale of petty tyranny turned epic justice. I was sipping my coffee in peace when I heard it. That screeching nails on a chalkboard voice echoing across the cul-de-sac. And before I could set my mug down, there she was, writhing on my driveway, her carefully ironed blouse now smeared with gravel, screaming at the top of her lungs as the officer snapped the cuffs around her wrists and read her rights. The whole neighborhood had gathered by now, phones out, jaws open, watching HOA Karen, the queen of citations, the self-declared law of our block, being hauled off like a common criminal. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just stood silently on my porch, arms crossed, watching the trap she set for me consume her whole. But to understand how we got here, you need to know that it didn't start with handcuffs or even driveways. It started with a garden gnome and a woman who hated happiness. I moved into Maple Ridge Estates for the quiet life. I'd retired early after decades as a civil engineer, bought a cozy little fixer-upper at the end of a sleepy cul-de-sac, and planned to spend my time sanding wood, growing tomatoes, and maybe teaching my niece a thing or two about DIY projects when she came to visit. But peace, I quickly learned, was illegal if Karen didn't approve of how it looked. The first warning came folded in cheap HOA letterhead. My garden gnome, a small cheerful thing named Earl, was allegedly not in compliance with neighborhood aesthetic standards. I thought it was a joke until the fine showed up. I removed Earl, but it didn't stop there. My mailbox was half an inch too tall. My grass grew 2 days too long. My trash bins lingered on the curb past the sanctioned retrieval window. I kept my head down, tried to reason with her, but the more I complied, the more she invented. That woman made rule violations out of thin air the way a magician pulls scarves from a sleeve. But the real shift happened the week before my niece was set to arrive. I just finished cleaning the driveway, patching a few cracks, and making sure there was room for her car to park beside mine. That same evening, I caught Karen staring at the driveway like it had insulted her mother. The next morning, I found a bright yellow HOA citation tucked under my doormat, claiming I had made unauthorized concrete modifications. I hadn't even poured anything, just patched a hole. Still, I figured if she wanted a war over flat gray rock, I wasn't going to hand her the match. Not yet. But Karen wasn't just content being annoying. She was tactical. One morning, I walked outside to find a few roofing nails glittering in the sunlight right near where my tires normally rolled in. I bent down, picked them up, and thought it was just neighborhood kids being careless. I tossed them. 2 days later, it happened again. Same spot, but this time the nails were partially embedded in the gravel edge of my driveway, poking up like tiny landmines. I couldn't prove it was her, but I knew she was too obvious and too smug not to be behind it. I installed a small camera hidden behind one of the solar lights near the driveway and waited. The footage that first night was uneventful. The second goal. There she was, dressed in her power walking outfit like she always wore in the mornings, leaning down under the pretense of picking up a piece of trash and palming a handful of nails right into the edge of the gravel. It was a perfect trap, impossible to notice unless you looked hard and aimed to give me a flat or worse, injure someone stepping out of a car. What she didn't realize was that my niece was arriving the next day and she'd be parking exactly in that spot. The thought that my family could have been hurt was what snapped something inside me. The gnome I could let slide. The grass citations, the mailbox height, even the fake trash bin ordinances I could tolerate. But this was criminal. And she just escalated beyond paper threats into something darker. I didn't retaliate right away. I kept quiet. I cleaned the gravel so she'd think I hadn't noticed. I even waved at her the next day. She gave me that smug smile she reserved for people she thought were beneath her. My niece arrived safe, thankfully, and I parked her car a few feet forward just in case. Then I handed her a USB drive and asked if she knew how to use TikTok. She did. Within 24 hours, the video of Karen beautifying the neighborhood with her little nails had gone semi-viral. But that wasn't the real plan. That was just bait. Karen, it turned out, had a tendency to double down when threatened. When she realized someone had exposed her, she didn't apologize or lay low. She tried to flip the narrative. She stormed into the HOA meeting with screenshots of my niece's account, demanding the board take action against me for harboring a menace and cyberbully in the neighborhood. She claimed the video was fake, edited, even accused me of stealing HOA property. The board was split. Some wanted to review the footage again. Others thought she was out of control, but none of them had seen what she did next. That very night, under the cover of dusk, Karen snuck onto my property again, but this time she brought a friend. He held a small toolkit, and she guided him with a flashlight right to the edge of my driveway. They planted a series of curved metal strips meant to puncture tires in reverse. Not just sabotage, but intentional injury. What she didn't know was that I had added 2 more cameras. One in the birdhouse above, one inside the porch light. I had her in HD from 3 angles, timestamped and backed up in the cloud. And more importantly, I had already tipped off Officer Maddox, the only sane cop in our sleepy little town, who'd quietly opened an investigation based on the first footage. When I called him that night, he was already a block away. The next morning, I invited Karen over under the pretense of wanting to resolve things like neighbors. She strutted up the driveway like Caesar returning from conquest, not knowing Maddox and his team were watching from an unmarked car around the corner. I offered her coffee. She declined. I asked her to explain the nails. She gaslit like a pro. Then, as if on cue, Maddox walked up the drive, showed her the footage on his phone, and said calmly that she was under arrest. She laughed, thought it was a prank until he cuffed her wrists, and read her rights while the entire street, half of whom she'd fined or cited in some way, watched in stunned silence. She screamed something about conspiracy, about HOA immunity. And the funniest part, she tripped over her own spike strip while being escorted to the cruiser. And as she sat in the back seat, still shouting, I looked down at the now peaceful concrete beneath my feet and thought, funny how clean things get when you finally sweep out the garbage. The irony of Karen's arrest was that it didn't slow her down, not even a little. If anything, it seemed to ignite something more feral in her. 2 days after her release on bail, she was back on the block, walking with her arms crossed, chin raised as if her public handcuffing had been a parade in her honor. But what Karen didn't realize was that everything had shifted. The neighbors who once cowed behind curtains now watched her openly. They didn't say anything, but their silence had changed. No longer fearful, just fed up. Meanwhile, I kept to myself, resumed my quiet routines, and focused on making the house feel warm and welcoming again because my niece Emily was staying this summer with me. She was 15 going on 30, a sharp-tongued girl with a love for photography and a passion for exposing injustice wherever she found it. I'd warned her about the HOA, about Karen, about the weird invisible lines you weren't supposed to cross on a block that prided itself on order. But I hadn't expected Karen to go after her directly. Not yet, anyway. Emily arrived the same day the city planted fresh trees along the boulevard, a beautification project Karen had opposed in 12 consecutive HOA meetings. When she saw the new saplings in Emily's car parked in my driveway, she stopped cold and gave the kind of long judgmental stare that could peel paint. I walked out to greet my niece and help her unload her suitcase. And Karen, not even waiting for a moment of privacy, said in her nasal drawl that minors without legal guardians should not be left unattended on HOA property. I smiled and said Emily was my guest, my responsibility, and had every right to be here. Emily just raised her phone, snapped a picture of Karen mid-glare, and walked inside without a word. That single act of teenage dismissal might have been what set the next series of events in motion. The next morning, an envelope appeared under my door. It was another HOA violation notice. This time citing me for use of driveway for non-vehicular purposes, accompanied by a grainy black and white image of Emily sitting on the trunk of her car sketching in a notebook. I was stunned by the reach of Karen's pettiness. A teenager sitting quietly minding her business. Somehow now a crime against the neighborhood. I didn't show Emily the letter, but she knew something was off. She caught the twitch in my jaw. The way I folded the paper tighter than necessary, the way I double-cheeked the porch camera. Karen had crossed the line again, and this time she was dragging someone innocent into her web. I knew I had to be careful, not just for myself, but because Emily had a way of documenting things and making them go viral. And the last thing I needed was a full-on internet war on my front lawn. That night, after dinner, Emily asked if she could film a short documentary about crazy neighborhood rules. I paused, then nodded and told her she could on one condition. No names, no accusations, just facts. She grinned and agreed. But what neither of us realized was that Karen was already watching again, this time from behind her tinted windows across the street. 2 days later, a drone buzzed above our roof. Emily was sitting on the patio editing her footage, and the buzzing was so loud it drowned out the music she was playing. I walked outside, squinting into the sun, and spotted the small black quadcopter circling like a vulture. I waved it off. It hovered. Emily pointed to the street and there was Karen standing with a remote control in hand, pretending to look at her garden while her thumb tapped buttons furiously. I walked over calmly and asked her what she thought she was doing. She didn't even blink, just said the HOA had authorized aerial sweeps to document code violations. I asked for the written authorization. She waved a stack of blank paper at me. I told her to land the drone. She told me to mind my own business. That was the moment I decided I wasn't going to be passive anymore. Not for Emily's sake. Not for my own. That evening, I installed a new camera system, a 360 degrees high-definition network, the kind I used to recommend to corporate clients in my engineering days. It fed directly to my phone and had infrared sound detection and motion tracking. I also added floodlights and a thermal sensor. Karen could play spy games, but she had no idea I was years ahead of her in tech. The next morning, I caught her again, this time standing just a foot onto my lawn, peering under my hedge. She was trying to spot illegal irrigation devices. I stepped outside and asked her calmly what she was doing on my property. She said the HOA had received a complaint about water theft. I told her to produce the complaint. She walked off. Emily recorded the whole thing from behind the curtain. That night, we posted a clip of the drone footage, blurred out the face, added humorous captions, and let it run online under a title Emily thought up. HOA or CIA? You decide. Within 6 hours, it had 10,000 views. The neighborhood grapevine buzzed louder than ever. People began sharing stories, anonymous at first, about weird things Karen had done to them. Someone said she clipped their roses because they leaned beyond the fence line. Another confessed she fined their dog for barking in a non-compliant tone. But the most serious was from a retired woman 3 houses down who revealed quietly that Karen had once tried to get her evicted over a misunderstood garage sale permit. She showed us paperwork. Karen had fabricated an email trail. That was the moment I knew Karen wasn't just petty. She was dangerous and she was a professional at hiding her trail. But now with Emily here, the evidence wasn't just anecdotal. It was on camera, timestamped, and getting public attention. I started assembling a folder. I collected every notice, every video clip, every drone pass, every line Karen had crossed. I labeled everything, backed it up twice, and sent one copy to a private attorney I used to work with years ago, just in case. Karen must have sensed something was shifting because she tried a new tactic. She sent a formal letter, not from the HOA, but from her personal stationery, requesting that Emily be sent home early for neighborhood cohesion and safety. She claimed the teen presence was creating a disruptive energy. I laughed when I read it, then stapled it to my folder of absurdity, but Emily, when she read it, didn't laugh. She got quiet. She asked if she should leave. That was the first time I saw her armor crack a little. I put a hand on her shoulder and told her she wasn't going anywhere, that she had every right to be here, that this was her summer, too. And I promised her right then that by the time she left, she would see justice done in a way that didn't involve shouting or fighting, but in a way that made the truth impossible to deny. She smiled, nodded, and picked up her camera again. And from that moment on, the game wasn't Karen versus me. It was Karen versus us, and we were just getting started. It was early morning when I first heard the crunch. A low, slow pop beneath my tires as I backed my truck out of the driveway to grab a few things from the hardware store. I rolled forward, parked, and stepped out, already uneasy. Sure enough, I saw it. My rear left tire sagging slightly, not quite flat, but clearly injured. I knelt beside it and found a clean puncture along the tread wall. Not torn, not worn down, but pierced, smooth, and deliberate. That alone wouldn't have been enough to prove anything. But then I saw the glint. Embedded in the gravel off the edge of my driveway were 3 sharp screws bent at strange angles and half concealed beneath the dust. Almost like someone had tried to make them look like construction leftovers. But I'd cleaned this driveway myself. Not 2 weeks ago, and I knew every inch of it. This was new and worse. It was precise. A few inches to the left and I wouldn't have hit them. A few to the right and Emily would have. That thought burned more than the tire. I picked up each screw carefully, placed them in a bag, and brought them inside, setting them on the table like a hunter laying out bones. Emily was still asleep, headphones in, blanket twisted around her like a cocoon, oblivious to the fact that someone had set a trap meant for one of us, or both. I didn't wake her. I just stood there watching her for a minute, thinking how far this had gone. This wasn't about noise complaints or trash bins anymore. This was about control, punishment. The next few hours were spent with tools, not to fix the tire that could wait, but to build my own test. I took an old rolling toolbox from the garage, bolted a wide plywood sheet to its base, and glued a thin strip of foam underneath. Then, I painted the foam bright red. My theory was simple. If Karen had planted more screws or spikes, they'd leave marks. I rolled the cart slowly, carefully over the driveway and gravel strip, checking every inch. Nothing at first, but then 5 feet from the mailbox, I saw it. A sharp metal shard lodged just enough into the soil to stay upright. Another a few inches away. Both were bent nails cut short, filed to points. I pulled them out with pliers, heart pounding in my chest, because now there was no doubt. This was engineered sabotage. I left the fake toolbox test rig near the garage and went back inside, pulling up the footage from the new 360 degrees camera. It took time to scrub through the hours of uneventful stillness. But finally, around 4:17 a.m., I caught a shadow. Not fully clear, not a face, but unmistakable in shape and movement. Someone in a windbreaker crouched low, crawling along the edge of my driveway with their hand dipping into a plastic bag. That wasn't a coincidence. That was a pattern. I zoomed, enhanced, ran it through some software to adjust brightness and caught just enough light from the neighbor's porch to see the high ponytail and wide sunglasses. Karen again. Emily came into the room rubbing her eyes, and before I could even explain, she sat down next to me and watched the footage in silence. When it ended, she looked up stone-faced and asked if she could borrow the clip. I didn't ask why. I just handed her a copy. She disappeared into her room. The next morning, Karen was hosting her usual community walk, something she started doing every Saturday, ever since the HOA let her form a neighborhood beautification subcommittee. Half a dozen residents joined her on these walks, thinking they were simply social events, not realizing they were being used to justify citations. I decided to join. I walked out just as the group passed my yard, gave a polite nod, and asked Karen if she'd like to see my new driveway paint color samples just to make sure it passed her standard. She blinked, clearly unsure how to respond to my sudden friendliness, then said, of course, she would be happy to help. I led the group around to the side of my house where I had 3 color samples taped to cardboard. I asked for their opinions, and as they gave them, I reached under the porch bench and pulled out the bag of driveway screws. I held it up, shook it gently, and said almost casually that I'd found these embedded in the gravel yesterday, right next to where Emily parks. The group quieted. Karen stiffened. I didn't accuse. I didn't raise my voice. I just asked if anyone else had found strange debris on their property. That was when old Mr. Halverson, who lived 2 houses down, spoke up. He said he'd replaced his right front tire twice this month, but hadn't thought much of it until now. Another woman, Dana from across the street, said her grandson had scraped his knee badly, stepping on something near their porch a few days ago. I watched Karen's face the entire time. She smiled, nodded, feigned concern, but her eyes darted, her fingers clenched. She knew the tide was shifting. That evening, Emily came out of her room grinning. She'd taken the footage and layered it with the results from our foam strip test, annotated it with arrows and slow-motion highlights, and uploaded it with a new title, Suburban Saboteur, The HOA Files, Episode 1. By midnight, it had racked up 20,000 views. The comments were a flood of disbelief, outrage, and dark comedy. The algorithm had done its magic. Karen's shadowy crouch had become a meme. People were tagging it with captions like "me sneaking snacks past my diet." And when you realize the trash takes itself out. The next day, someone from the HOA board rang my bell. It was Martin, the treasurer, a soft-spoken man who rarely got involved. He asked to speak privately. We sat on the porch. He said in a low voice that he'd seen the video, that several other board members had too, that while the HOA couldn't act without formal proceedings, they were no longer willing to back Karen's complaints without evidence. He asked me to keep documenting, to keep everything professional. I promised him I would. That same evening, as if to mock me, Karen taped another violation notice to my door. This one claimed Emily had violated the community noise ordinance by laughing too loudly during daylight hours. I took the notice, turned it over, and wrote in large block letters, "Evidence-backed counterclaim pending." I taped it back to her own mailbox. The following day, I began planning something else entirely. Karen had escalated with hidden traps and phantom complaint. I would respond with data, with law, and with a touch of spectacle. But first, I needed bait. Something so appealing, so perfectly Karen and infuriating that she wouldn't be able to resist tampering again. And I already had the perfect idea. A driveway party, family-friendly, permitted through the city, complete with music, lights, and food truck. And the best part, it would take place on the one patch of ground she believes she ruled. I just had to wait for the right moment because this wasn't about revenge. It was about showing Karen that the days of her secret power plays were over. That in this neighborhood, evidence beat ego. Every time I submitted the event permit the next morning before sunrise, half out of strategy, half out of sheer satisfaction. The city clerk, a woman named Marka with reading glasses always hanging halfway down her nose, barely looked up when I handed her the application and event map. She just stamped it with the swiftness of someone who'd seen too many block parties and not enough scandal. But this was different. This wasn't just about food trucks and folding chairs. This was a performance, a careful baited stage built atop a driveway that had seen more conflict in the past month than a courtroom in a soap opera. The event was set for the following weekend. That gave me 6 days to build not just anticipation, but discomfort, the kind that made Karen squirm without understanding why. The first wave was the banners. Emily and I printed them ourselves using an old vinyl cutter I had in the garage. Neighborhood Unity Day in oversized cheerful letters. Beneath it, the tagline, "Let's pave a better future together." I hung one on the front of the house and another across 2 garden stakes at the end of the driveway. By noon, I'd seen Karen make 5 separate trips to her mailbox just for an excuse to stare. Her neck was stiff, her hands twitchy. She didn't ask about the event. She didn't have to. She knew it was sanctioned. She knew she couldn't stop it, but I could feel her brain chewing on the inside of her skull as she tried to imagine how this was legal. That evening, Emily caught her walking back and forth on her lawn, holding a tape measure, clearly checking the distance from her property line to mine. The footage was hilarious, Karen muttering to herself, squinting through reading glasses, dropping the tape twice. We didn't post that one yet. Instead, we focused on preparations. We invited the entire neighborhood, slipped printed flyers into mailboxes, even invited the police department, not as guests of war, but as community supporters. Officer Maddox confirmed he'd swing by for an hour off duty just to make sure things stayed civil. That alone set the chessboard in motion because now Karen couldn't crash the party without tripping over a badge. But it was the discovery on Wednesday afternoon that shifted everything. Emily had wandered next door to return a borrowed folding chair when Dana, the woman who lived there, invited her in for lemonade. What started as casual talk turned into a confession. Dana revealed that Karen had once tried to get her evicted over a flower bed extension allegedly planted 3 in over HOA code. She said Karen had shown up with a printout of an ordinance, one she couldn't find in the official handbook, and threatened a daily fine. Dana had complied, dug up the entire row of lilies. But a month later, she'd found the same printout buried behind a box in her garage and noticed something odd. The font was different, the paper slightly off-white. It had been forged. Emily came back buzzing with the story and showed me a photo of the paper Dana had kept. I compared it to an official HOA document from my own collection. The difference was undeniable. Karen had created fake citations, not just exaggerated complaints, forged policy. That night, I stayed up past midnight building a digital case file. Screenshots, overlays, timestamp, the fake ordinance scanned and contrasted with a real one. I included Karen's false citations to me and matched the language patterns. The excessive use of the phrase to preserve neighborhood integrity showed up in every one of her notices, but none of the official HOA records. It was like her signature. But the true smoking gun came from a neighbor 3 houses down, Mr. Beasley, who'd never said much to anyone. He was quiet, a retired librarian who kept to himself, and spent most of his time bird-watching. I approached him politely the next day, asked if he'd ever had issues with Karen. He didn't answer right away, just invited me inside, made 2 cups of tea, and brought out a shoebox. Inside were dozens of HOA notices, all dated from the past 3 years, all from Karen. But what made them stand out was the fact that Beasley had recorded every single conversation he'd ever had with her. As a habit, he pulled out a small voice recorder and played a clip for me. It was from last year where Karen, clear as day, said to him, "Mr. Beasley, the HOA board won't approve this rule officially, but I have ways of nudging compliance." Then a pause, then sometimes you have to be the bad guy for the greater good. It was damning, not illegal on its own, but paired with the forged document, the video footage, and the community testimonies, it painted a chilling picture. She'd been inventing rules, disguising them as official, and enforcing them through intimidation. She hadn't just abused her power, she'd manufactured it. Emily and I took the audio, layered it with captions and corresponding citations, and added it as the opening to her next video. HOA Karen's Secret Empire Episode 2. It went up the night before the party and it exploded. Over 50,000 views in 10 hours. People in the comments were sharing similar experiences, some even from other states. The story had struck a nerve, and it wasn't just entertainment anymore. It was exposure. The next morning, I found a letter taped to my truck windshield. It wasn't signed, but written in the same tidy, all-caps style Karen used for her HOA minutes. It read, "You've gone too far. The community will turn on you. End this now." I didn't report it. I didn't panic. I framed it and hung it on the garage wall next to my inspection tools because that letter told me I'd hit the right nerve. Saturday arrived with perfect weather. Sunlight without humidity, a soft breeze. We set up folding tables, hung string lights, laid out games for the kids, even set up a small DIY taco stand with help from Dana and Halverson. The whole block turned out. Families I hadn't spoken to in weeks came out smiling. Music played softly from a Bluetooth speaker. Emily took photos. People laughed. It was normal, unburdened, real. But of course, Karen came. She didn't join. She stood at the end of the street, arms crossed, watching like a sentry. Maddox nodded to her once, then turned away. She paced. She muttered to herself, but she didn't approach. She couldn't. Not without triggering suspicion, not without inviting questions. But she didn't need to storm the party to cause chaos. Just after sundown, as the last of the guests began to head home, I noticed something odd near the mailbox. A faint shimmer on the gravel. I walked over with my flashlight and bent down. It was another spike wedged in the loose stones. Brand new, planted within the past hour. I didn't touch it. I flagged it with a marker cone, snapped photos, and called Maddox. He returned, examined it, and said the words I'd been waiting to hear for weeks. "This is enough. We're opening a formal investigation." And for the first time in this whole mess, I saw a different expression on Karen's face. Not smugness, not defiance, but something between fear and fury. The kind of look someone wears when they realize the game they started no longer belongs to them. The neighborhood had started to shift in ways Karen couldn't control anymore. And she felt it. You could see it in how she lingered on sidewalks now, watching conversations she wasn't part of. How her shoulders curled in just slightly as families who once nodded politely now ignored her completely. But like a storm with no sense of timing, she refused to let the winds die down peacefully. Instead of retreating, she escalated with the kind of desperation that only comes from a person who built their identity on domination and was now watching it unravel thread by thread. It was the following Monday when I noticed the garbage can at the end of my driveway was slightly ajar. Nothing strange at first glance until I went to roll it back and saw it was heavier than usual. Curious, I opened the lid fully, and there it was, a used paint can half full, leaking sticky blue-gray sludge that matched none of the work I'd done on the house in the past year. I hadn't touched anything involving that shade since the porch paint project nearly 18 months ago. I didn't put it there, but I had a very good idea who did. I put on gloves, photographed everything, then carefully checked the footage. Around 4:03 a.m., just like clockwork, Karen appeared on camera in a hoodie, face obscured, dragging a black trash bag, tiptoeing like a cartoon burglar. She opened my garbage lid, placed something inside, wiped her hands on her pants, and walked away. What made it laughable was the way she paused mid-step and actually looked up at the camera dead on like some sixth sense had told her it was there. But she didn't panic. She just smiled. That smug, petty smirk. Then she kept walking. It was like she wanted to be caught, like she was daring me to accuse her. I forwarded the clip to Officer Maddox, who called back within 10 minutes and said this was exactly what they needed. She wasn't just violating HOA ethics anymore. This was criminal trespass, illegal dumping, and depending on the paint, potential hazardous waste charges. But we didn't stop there. The investigation had been growing steadily behind the scenes. And now it was nearing the point of no return. Maddox connected with city code enforcement, and a quiet cross-check of neighborhood maintenance invoices began. That was when things turned from annoying to outright shocking. Over the last year, the HLA had approved nearly 14 minor beautification projects. Tree replacements, fence painting, sidewalk pressure washing, but a deeper dive revealed that 3 of those projects had never happened. Not officially. The city had no record of completing them. The vendors listed had no business licenses. Yet, the HOA's bank statements, which Martin, the treasurer, had finally opened under pressure, showed thousands paid out under names no one recognized. The money trail didn't just lead to fake businesses. It led to a personal account under a different name tied to an out-of-town address. A quick search confirmed it was a property owned by Karen's cousin. It was fraud, plain and simple. And now it wasn't just my problem. The entire board was spooked. Martin quietly arranged an emergency session and asked me to attend as a witness. Emily and I showed up together, USB drives in hand, and laid out every frame of video we'd collected. Spike traps, trash dumping, drone harassment, fake citations, voice clip. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't attack her character. I simply let the evidence speak. And when I played the voice recording of Karen saying she had ways of nudging compliance, the room went dead silent. You could hear people shift in their seats, the weight of realization pressing down on them like a thundercloud ready to break. But Karen didn't show up to the meeting. She claimed a migraine, sent a note instead. The note was typed, not signed, filled with vague legal threats and declarations of innocence, but no denials, no defense, just smoke and mirrors. And that's when the board made a decision I never thought I'd see. They froze the HOA accounts until a full forensic audit could be completed. They suspended Karen's voting privileges, and they notified the county district attorney of possible embezzlement. Still, I knew her well enough to expect that she wouldn't go quietly, and I was right. Just 2 days later, she played her final card. I was in the backyard with Emily, teaching her how to seal a wooden planter box when I heard a car pull up out front and doors slam with purpose. We came around the corner just in time to see 2 uniformed officers walking up our lawn. Karen trailing behind them, wearing the theatrical look of false justice, as if she were the hero bringing a criminal to light. She'd filed a police report claiming I was building illegal structures on the property without permits, using them to hide surveillance devices that violated HOA privacy right. It was a desperate, ridiculous claim, but not one the police could ignore on paper. They were required to investigate. The officers were polite, professional, but firm. I invited them in, showed them every inch of the project. No structure, no hidden devices, just a planter box, a few tools, and a backyard full of flowers and tomatoes. When they saw the footage I'd recorded of Karen approaching with them from the street, smirking toward the camera, one of them gave a small shake of the head, but they had to do their job. They left without incident, filing a note that there were no violations, no grounds for concern. Karen stood by her car, watching, arms crossed like she expected a victory speech. Instead, one of the officers handed her a pink slip of paper, a citation for false reporting. The look on her face melted in real time from smugness to confusion to raw, unrehearsed panic. It was the first time I'd ever seen her genuinely speechless. But it still wasn't the end. That came a day later when the city inspector, Maddox, and a plainclothes DA investigator all showed up at the HOA clubhouse with a warrant. I wasn't there, but Martin later told me that Karen arrived just as they were leaving, tried to bluff her way past them, and was calmly told to step aside. She refused. She raised her voice. She tried to cite bylaws, and then finally, she snapped in front of half the board and two neighbors. She threw her clipboard at the DA rep and screamed that she was doing this for the good of the community, that she made this neighborhood what it is, that we'd all be lost without her. She was handcuffed 30 seconds later. No drama, no resistance, just silence after that. Emily and I watched it happen from across the street. Not in person on live camera. We didn't cheer. We didn't speak. We just stood there shoulder to shoulder as the woman who had tried so hard to break us finally broke herself. And as the cruiser pulled away and the sunlight caught the last spike trap she'd never removed, still glittering faintly in the gravel, I realized something strange. I didn't feel joy. I felt relief because for the first time in months, the block felt like it could finally breathe again. The neighborhood moved like a body recovering from illness in the days that followed Karen's arrest. It wasn't loud or immediate or euphoric. It was quiet, slow, and cautious, like people were testing the limits of a new kind of freedom. Lawns were mowed a day late without panic. A woman painted her fence eggshell white instead of HOA regulation beige, and no one said a word. Kids rode scooters along the sidewalk without being scolded about helmet permits or noise threshold. The HOA clubhouse, once Karen's headquarters of control, now sat dormant, its doors locked, its windows empty of the laminated rule posters she used to tape up weekly. But I didn't let myself relax. Not yet. Because if there's one thing I learned from months of her antics, it's that power like hers doesn't just disappear because a pair of handcuffs finally catch up. It lingers in the system she manipulated, in the files she created, in the lies she normalized and spread like pollen across everything she touched. And I knew she wasn't done. Not in her mind. She'd built a fortress of authority out of paper, fear, and ego. The arrest may have knocked her off the throne, but I had no doubt she was still trying to climb back into the castle. I started by going over the remnants of what she left behind. Martin gave me access to the digital HOA database and asked if I could help sort out which violations were real and which were likely fabricated. It took hours, dozens of emails, and more than a few late nights. But Emily and I cross-referenced every incident log with surveillance footage, resident statements, and HOA bylaws. What we found was astounding. Over half the violations Karen had issued in the last year were either based on non-existent rules or manipulated interpretations of vague policies. She had created a shadow code book, one that she enforced selectively, almost always against people who disagreed with her or dared to be too independent. She fined an elderly couple for using wind chimes louder than 20 dBs, a rule that didn't exist. She cited a single father for leaving his porch light on past 11 p.m., another imaginary rule. She even issued a violation to a teenager for inappropriate car bumper aesthetics. That one nearly made me laugh if it hadn't been so outrageous. But this wasn't just paperwork anymore. This was damage. Some residents had paid hundreds in fines they didn't owe, believing the notices were real. Others had altered their homes or routines unnecessarily. One man had sold his antique fountain out of fear he'd be sued for unregulated water features. It was theft in disguise, intimidation with illegal phase. So I compiled everything, every manipulated rule, every falsified citation, every instance of abuse. I put it all into one file digitally backed up and also printed thick as a novel and handed it directly to the city attorney's office through Matic. They didn't need convincing. The DA had already started preparing additional charges. Fraud, forgery, abusive position, possibly even racketeering if they could prove she'd conspired with anyone to redirect HOA funds. The board formally stripped her of membership and began reaching out to victims of her false citations, offering apologies and beginning the long process of reversing the damage. But still, I didn't feel done. Not because I wanted vengeance, but because I needed to ensure this never happened again. Not here, not to anyone else. So, I drafted a proposal, a new policy for the HOA, one that required all violations be approved by at least 2 board members and submitted with timestamped documentation. I added clauses about third-party audits, digital transparency, and resident dispute. Right. Emily helped format it and suggested calling it the Karen clause. I laughed, said no. But we did tuck the nickname into the document footer as a silent middle finger. At the next board meeting, we presented the policy. The room was fuller than I'd ever seen it. Residents showed up with interest, not fear. They asked questions. They made suggestions. And when the vote came, it passed unanimously. That night, the neighborhood felt different in a way that no lighting, pavement, or landscaping could have ever accomplished. It felt fair. Not perfect, not magically transformed, but fair. Still, just when I thought the story was over, one last twist surfaced. Small, quiet, but sharp. It came in the form of a manila envelope tucked into my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a single photograph printed in grainy black and white showing me and Emily standing on our porch 2 weeks ago. The angle was slightly elevated, taken from the back corner of the block. There was a note handwritten in uneven block letters. It said, "They're still watching. Be careful who you trust." I didn't show it to Emily. Not yet. I took it straight to Maddox, who examined it and said it looked like it had been taken from the second floor of a house on Birch Lane, the side street that curves behind our property. He said it could be someone connected to Karen, maybe a sympathizer, or maybe just a coward trying to stir paranoia. He advised me to stay alert. I installed 2 more cameras the next day and made a mental note to visit the homes on Birch Lane and see who might have had that vantage point. But deep down I knew what this was. A last gasp. One final whisper from a defeated empire. Karen was behind bars awaiting arraignment. Her name was smeared across every local paper and HOA forum. Her empire had crumbled. But some shadows don't know how to vanish. They just linger until you drag them fully into the light. And I was ready to do that if it came to it. That weekend, I walked the block with Emily like it was nothing. We visited neighbors, shared stories, helped an old man fix his fence. A girl gave Emily a thank you card with a doodle of her as a superhero holding a phone. It was funny and sweet and deeply earned. And as we stood outside under a sky without drones, without whispers, without the hum of low-grade sabotage, I finally allowed myself to feel what I hadn't yet dared to trust. Peace. The kind that comes not from silence, but from the knowledge that you stood up when it counted, that you didn't bend, that you used the very system twisted against you to straighten it again. And the driveway beneath my feet, smooth, whole, scarred with stories but free of traps, felt like more than concrete. It felt like resolution. It had been 3 weeks since Karen was let off in cuffs, her shrieks still echoing faintly in the memory of every resident who had once been forced to nod politely as she measured their mailboxes or squinted at their hedges. The neighborhood was still adjusting like a ship slowly correcting its course after a long storm. Unsure if the water was finally calm or just playing trick, the HOA board had changed, not just in leadership, but in tone. Meetings were now open, honest, even occasionally lighthearted. People brought snacks. Questions were answered without condescension. Policies were re-examined with fresh eyes, and more than a few of Karen's pet projects were dismantled altogether. The unnecessary flower bed fencing law was repealed. The front porch light ordinance was erased. The block even voted to allow color variety in shutters as long as it stayed within a reasonable spectrum. It was small stuff, really, but it meant everything. I watched all of it unfold with a quiet sense of accomplishment. Not pride, not arrogance, just the sober relief of knowing that something poisonous had been pulled out at the root. And still, I didn't consider myself the hero. I had just been the one pushed far enough to stop standing still. The real momentum had come from the neighbors, from Emily, from everyone who had finally decided that silence wasn't safety. It was surrender. The odd part was how peaceful things were now. Without Karen's watchful eye, people began using their yards more freely. Kids drew chalk art on sidewalks without citations appearing in their parents' inboxes. One couple started hosting weekly game nights out in their garage with the door open, music playing softly, laughter spilling into the street like it belonged there. Dana planted lilies again, the same variety Karen had once threatened her over. And Mr. Halverson, who rarely left his house before, started sitting out on his porch every evening with a cup of tea and a slow wave for anyone passing by. Emily had shifted, too. Her summer project, which began as a joke, a way to vent her frustration with a camera and a few snarky edits, had turned into something deeper. The HOA Karen series had gone viral. Episode 3, the one featuring the board meeting audio, had hit over 100,000 views within days. People from across the country were commenting, sharing their own horror stories about overreaching HOAs and many dictators disguised as neighborhood volunteers. She was invited onto a local podcast to talk about community accountability. A college journalism program even reached out to ask if she would consider applying next year. She was 15, but her eyes were sharper now, her humor more balanced, her curiosity anchored in something real. I saw a different kind of fire in her, less reactive, more focused. She hadn't just recorded what happened. She had understood it. And that gave me a deeper kind of hope. One evening, just as the sun dipped low and the houses began to glow with porch lights and lazy conversations, Emily and I sat on the front steps watching the last traces of pink vanish from the sky. She asked me what I thought would happen to Karen now. I told her the legal system was slow but steady, that Karen would face charges for fraud, trespassing, tampering with public property, and likely a host of civil suits from the residents she fined illegally. That even if she somehow avoided jail time, she would never be in a position of power again. Not here, not anywhere nearby. Emily nodded, silent for a moment, then asked a question I hadn't expected. She asked if I ever felt sorry for her. I had to think about that, not because the answer was difficult, but because it had layers. I told her I didn't feel sorry for what Karen lost, because it had never been hers to begin with. The power, the control, the fear she wielded like a tool. None of it was earned. But I did feel sorry for what she had become. For the life she chose to live, so obsessed with order that she couldn't see how lonely she was, how much damage she did, how hollow her victories were. That maybe once there had been a decent person inside her, someone who just wanted to keep the neighborhood beautiful, someone who enjoyed gardening or decorating or community pride. But that person had been consumed by the persona she built around herself. And in the end, it collapsed. Not because we attacked her, but because she pushed too hard against everyone and forgot that power without trust is brittle. Emily listened without interrupting, then simply said, "Yeah, I guess sometimes villains aren't born. They just forget to stop." The next day, a letter arrived in the mailbox, this time with a return address and stamped officially from the county clerk's office. It was an invitation to provide a formal impact statement regarding the case against Karen. I stared at it for a long time before placing it on the kitchen table. Emily asked if I was going to do it. I said yes, but I wasn't going to make it about revenge. I was going to write about the driveway, about how a piece of pavement became a battlefield. About how a girl with a camera and an uncle with a quiet mind stood their ground with facts, patience, and decency. About how truth didn't have to shout if it came armed with evidence. And about how no HOA policy should ever be strong enough to justify punishing kindness, curiosity, or individuality. It took me an hour to write. I submitted it that evening, and I slept soundly for the first time in what felt like months. On the final Saturday before Emily was due to leave, we hosted one last gathering. Not a party, just a relaxed evening on the driveway. We set out some chairs, grilled a few burgers, played music low and easy. Neighbors came by with plates and drinks and folding tables. No permits were needed. No one measured distances. A group of teenagers chalked a giant thank you message across the sidewalk in cartoon bubble letters. And when the sun finally set and the laughter faded into quiet conversation, I stood alone for a moment, looking out over the concrete. The same driveway where it all began. The same place where nails were once hidden, citations were once tossed, and fear had once been planted like a weed. Now it held stories, footprints, painted drawings, and not a single screw. Just peace, just people, just life moving forward. The trap had been set, but not by me. And in the end, the only one who ever truly fell into it was the one who built it.